Hello and welcome to the Gardens and Graveyards channel. My name is Charisma and today we are hanging out in my studio and I'm going to talk to you about plots in the cemetery. So as many of you know, I manage a cemetery in Newport, Oregon, and I have a lot of insight on how to go about buying your plot. And I wanted to talk to you about it because generally how you choose a plot is very similar everywhere you go. So it's not going to be a big challenge from what I tell you about in this video to wherever you may choose to buy a plot. What am I talking about? A plot is a piece of land, right? That's what a plot is. It could be anywhere, but when we're talking about cemetery plots, we're talking about specifically lots and plots that are available for sale in the cemetery for you to be buried in or your loved one to be buried in. So generally, plots are 4 foot wide by 8 feet long. There's some fluctuations in some cemeteries. They may be like 3 feet by 9 feet or 7 feet, but general consensus is 4 foot by 8 foot. And when you buy a plot from a cemetery, you are the owner of that tiny piece of land. You get a deed and it's yours. And there's some little restrictions. You can't bury anybody or anything there. You can't like put a vault of money in there or your horse or something. Depending on the cemetery, I can't speak for all cemeteries. Our cemetery specifically says in the deed and in all of our bylaws that our cemetery grounds are dedicated to human remains only, which means nothing else can be like buried there. We can't put our trash or your favorite Land Rover. You can't be buried in your Land Rover or anything like that. Although, could you? I've never had that request. I do know that people get buried in their cars. Not on my cemetery so far, but I've read accounts where that happens. They're wider than 4 feet anyway, so that doesn't matter. Anyway, I digress. There are exceptions to the rule, of course, as far as purchasing and owning your plot. I don't know if there's cemeteries like this in America. I have not researched it out to find out, but I do know that in very highly populated areas that have had a high population for many, many generations, specifically London and Mexico City, those two specific places I know, they lease their plot, their land. So you lease a 4 by 8 space for your family to be buried. And then there are restrictions on how long that land is yours. So in London, from what I read, is after 75 years without use, that lot goes back, it reverts back to the cemetery. I haven't figured out, I only read like a small article about it, but I had some questions. Do they only allow green burials or cremains? Because that would make sense to me, that after 75 years, the human remains would be gone and that plot would be available for the next person. Or is it just like the family purchased it and never used the plot, so then it reverts back? Because that would be amazing. I have at minimum, 20 to 30, probably more, for sure 20, lots that were purchased back in the early 1900s, like 1918 to 1925, and all the way up into the 50s and 60s, where a family would buy 5 or more lots for their entire family, and then a spouse would be buried, and it's usually like it's usually instigated by that, right? Somebody dies and they buy a lot and they're like, oh, I want to make sure that I get buried next to this person and our whole family gets buried next to this person. So they buy multiple lots around that person's lot. But what happened many times is this community was very young at that time. So the families had just moved here, and then they bury their loved one. And then it stayed a tiny small town, and all the teenagers were like, we're out of here. So the families got dispersed, and there's no more family left, and nobody else was buried in the lots. And I have many lots where there's 1 or 5 lots that just sit empty because they were purchased well over 100 years ago. But our deeds say that you own the lot perpetually, which means forever, no matter what. So I can't sell those lots to anybody new. They'll never get sold or used because the families are long, long gone, and doubtful that anybody remembers that great-great-grandma was buried in our cemetery. We have had 2 occasions since I've been managing the cemetery. Twice we've had families that were contacted for other reasons. Like one was a broken marker, and we finally tracked down a great-grandson and said, hey, you know, this marker got broken. How do you want to work with us on this? And he was like, I have some cremains. I need to buy a lot. And we're like, oh, you have lots here. So that was amazing. And then another family, they lost a young family member, and they came and said, well, you know, I have relatives over in this section. So we want to be buried in this cemetery. And we were like, oh, you have an open lot over here with your relatives. They were like, amazing. So they were able to actually be buried with their family rather than just in the general vicinity in the same cemetery. So really fun stories like that happen. So maybe if you know of a family member from a long time ago that maybe bought multiple lots, you can check in on that cemetery and see if that's the cemetery you want to be buried in, and if those lots are still available for the next of kin. So what happens with a deed, just like with a house, is the next of kin gets the deed, and you know, usually it's in a will, but if it's not, it's just the natural progression of the next of kin receives the deed. So that's always really awesome. It gets a little crazy when there's multiple kids and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and then it becomes a family issue, and the family needs to just like work that out. That's not on the cemetery to figure that out. But if your family figures it out and then you decide to be buried in one of the old lots, awesome. That's one way that you can get a cemetery lot. Okay, so back to London. So they have a 75-year lease on their lots, and like I said, I'm not really sure how that works, whether they're empty lots or reused after the burial is 75 years old. And they may be doing something like they were burying people 8 feet down rather than 6 feet down, so that there's plenty of space on top of the old burial to bury the next person. I'm not sure of the logistics, but those are all options that could happen. And then in Mexico City, because they are so populated, and they have been so populated for so long that there's no more land available for burying. And the majority of the religious practices in Mexico City is Catholic, and their religious practice requires them to be buried in a casket. And so what they do is they bury their loved ones in the leased land, and then after a certain amount of time, and like it's short, a year maybe, I hope it's not 30 days, I'm not sure, I think it's a year, and then the family member that was buried is what's called exhumed or disinterred, which means they remove the casket from the ground, and then they are cremated. And cremains are much easier to find space for than a casket with a human body in it. So and then that land just gets used again. And so sometimes I've read two different scenarios is families will just keep releasing that same plot. So all their family members get buried there and then disinterred and cremated, and it just keeps it in the family line. Other families will just lease that plot for the amount of time that is allowed, and then if they have another person die, they lease another lot that's available, and they don't just keep using the same lot. That is not typical in American cemeteries. We haven't gotten to that point in our population where we're completely running out of room, although it's happening more and more in metro areas. But right now, so many of our cemeteries are rural that we still have the practice of selling you your plot, and you own it and you get to use it. In our cemetery, and this is pretty common practice, it's not like 100% standard, but it's common. If you own a lot, one casket can be buried there. We used to do double caskets, which means we would bury the first casket at double depth, and then the next casket could be buried on top of that casket when the time came. We no longer do that, mostly due to equipment that we no longer have access to, but also because the two main areas that we have the most lots available in, they have a high water table, and so burying at a double depth just means we're flooding the lower casket, which is just not super cool. So we stopped doing that many years ago, maybe like 10-ish years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. But that's an option. Some families choose that, and some cemeteries still do that. But in our cemetery, if you have one casket burial, you can also bury 4 cremains, 4 urns on top of that casket. Or if you have no caskets in the ground in your lot, you can do 8 urns in that lot. These lots could hold a lot more than 8 urns, especially if you were stacking them and then, going long ways and deep. You could probably hold a lot more. It's just what our cemetery board chose and voted on, and is in our bylaws, that we could have 8 cremains or 1 casket and 4 cremains. So ask your local cemetery where you want to be buried if that is a practice that they do. You can have multiple cremains, and how many, because honestly, if you have a smaller family, or even if you have a big family and you buy multiple lots, you could pretty much put your whole family in one lot if your cemetery agreed to do something like that. Where it gets a little bit tricky is your markers. So if you have a standard marker, we talked about this in the video last week. So if you missed that, go back and look and watch the markers video. But our standard markers are 12 inches by 24 inches with cement around them. And our lots would hold 4 of those markers. So if you have 8 people in the ground with only 4 markers available, you'll have to start putting 2 names on each marker. So if you had a lot or a cemetery that allowed like 16 or 30 urns in a space, then I don't know, you're gonna have to get like a big plaque and just have everybody's names and dates on it without much personalization, I would think. So something to consider and think about when you're choosing your plots. Now the next thing you're going to consider is, where is it located? Of course, the cemetery is where the cemetery is. Our cemetery has many ocean views, so that's pretty amazing. Some cemeteries have other, city views and forest views and just beautiful rolling hills and who knows, whatever. So you might consider, what's the view? What's the view for the deceased? Maybe that's important to you. What's the view for the living that remain? Like, where are they going to sit and hang out? That might be important to you. So consider that view. But more importantly, when I think about lot placement, I think about when I'm older and I want to visit my family, how accessible is that lot? So I don't necessarily want my lot to be right on the road, because what if like somebody's distraught and runs over my lot or something like that? So I want to go in a few, but I don't really want to be in the middle of the cemetery where I have to walk a long distance and uneven ground when I'm old and maybe unable to get into that middle ground. Or maybe I want to be completely surrounded by people and I want to just feel like I'm in the middle of everything, and I do want a middle plot. So consider those types of locations, or the, how close is it to the office? How close is it away from the office? How close is it to the maintenance, like loud equipment going on? If they're doing like working on their tractors or something like that, maybe you don't want to be really close to the maintenance building. Those are all things that you might consider when you're choosing what lot to buy. What else? We talked about pre-needs in a couple of videos ago. So when you buy your lot, that's a one set fee. But then there's other costs that are involved with burials, such as the opening and closing of the grave and the liner and the caskets and all of those types of things. So if you're curious about what those types of costs what kind of costs might come up with a burial, watch that video. This video is really just about choosing your plot. So every cemetery and nowadays has been platted out. So they're usually in some sort of a grid, and they have a number associated with them, so everybody knows exactly where they are at all times. Many cemeteries are on GPS now, which is really fun because it's easy to find your loved ones, but it's also just really easy for the cemetery office to find you. Our cemetery is not on GPS. It costs a lot of money to have GPS implemented into an old cemetery. So if your cemetery does not have one, be kind. They may not just have the funding to implement something like that. Let's see. So when you get a deed, you'll be given your plot number, and that will carry through forever. Even if you lose the deed, if family knows the plot number, that's really helpful. Another interesting thing about plots is it's standard for the head of the person who's buried, if they're buried in a casket or liner or even a green burial. It's standard that the head lays in the west and the feet are in the east of the cemetery. And the idea behind that is Christian based, and the idea is that when Jesus comes back, the person will rise facing the east, because the theory is that when Christ returns, he will return in the east. And so imagine, if this was the body, this would be the head, this would be the feet, and they would rise. And so the head would be in the west, and the feet would be in the east. So consider that when you're looking at your lots. People get very confused in our lots because the headstone, of course, goes over the head, but somewhere many moons ago, they were placing the headstone so that the writing If your back was facing the west and you're looking down, the writing is correct. So that means the person is buried above the headstone, which is so confusing for people, especially because we have the ocean here in the West. And so people automatically assume that the head would be facing the ocean, because you would think that they'd want the view of the ocean. But that's not how it is. The headstone is here and the writing is facing this way, but the person is facing that way. So if that's something that concerns you and you want to know exactly where the person is laying or where you'll be laying, make sure you ask those questions so that it's really clear for you. We have requests that the casket be turned the other way, and that's totally fine. We do that. We also have requests that the marker gets turned the other way, which is also fine. We do that as well. It's, strange when they're all like topsy-turvy. We just make notes on your contracts so that everybody knows what's going on. Especially with the markers, people are like, hey, did you put the marker in upside down? No, it was a family request. So just, those are things that you might consider when you're buying your lots. I'm not going to talk about price of lots on this video because the prices vary so greatly. I mean, we're talking about $500 all the way up to $15,000 for a lot. And it completely depends on where you will be buried. 100%. Not the cemetery doesn't go from 500 to 15,000, but the nation, the U.S. does. On our lots, on our cemetery, we do have a fluctuation. The old section, the pioneer section, is actually more expensive. It's the historical section. There's less space available, and it is the most sought after section after our newest edition. Our newest edition is the number one right now, but people really love being in the old section. The old section is also the only section that we allow upright markers. All the rest of our cemetery are flat markers. So sometimes that determines why a person would want to be buried over there, because they want an upright marker. But it is more expensive over there. And then we have less expensive ones where they're just for urns. So the urn burial plots are 3 foot by 3 foot, so that they fit 2 urns in there. So that's an option if you wanted to just have a couple of urns in a lot and you didn't want the full lot. And then, of course, we have a scattering garden and a mausoleum and a niche wall. Those are different things. I'll link below the difference between the different ways that you could be buried in the cemetery. Today I'm just talking about your standard plot or lot. Trying to think if there's anything else that I really wanted to tell you about. The deed will be put, if you buy it for yourself when you're living, it'll be put in your name. If you buy it for a loved one after they've passed, the deed will actually be placed in the loved one's name, because that is who is there. That is who is occupying that lot. And so the deed will be placed in the deceased name, but you'll be the owner of the lot because you'll be the next of kin, if that makes sense. So don't get weirded out by that. Sometimes if the deed comes to you and it's in the deceased's name, sometimes that kind of freaks people out. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Oh, I will say, because you're the owner of the plot, it is your responsibility to take care of your plot. So if you have a headstone on your plot, you need to take care of it. You need to clean it. You need to make sure that the moss and the grass isn't growing over it. You need to just maintain the general area. If there's, if you notice anything going on, like a broken pipe nearby, or it's flooding, or, you know, you're regularly getting like trash or something on that lot, or something like that, you might bring that attention to the office and they'll work with you on how to remedy the situation. The lawn should be maintained by the cemetery caretakers. Depending on your cemetery, some cemeteries don't have cemetery caretakers, and then it's solely your responsibility. But most cemeteries do have a little bit of funding so that the grounds will be at least maintained, mowed, and mowed. That's pretty much it. It's our cemetery is so small, and we're in a rural community, and we just don't have the funding to do things like fertilizer, or reseeding, or irrigation, or weed eating, or weeding in general. Like, we have dandelions, they just get mowed down. That's all that happens. We do a little bit of weed eating around markers when time allows, but mostly it's just mowing. And really, our mowing season comes, and that's all there's time for our groundskeeper to go from section to section. We have 7 additions, and pretty much he mows 1 to 2 additions every single day, 5 days a week, and that's all he really, and between that and burials and getting markers in the ground, there's no time for anything else in the summertime, in the mowing season. So consider that. Also, with lots, you can bring flowers. Most cemeteries allow you to bring flowers still. Many cemeteries are getting away from fake flowers, from plastic flowers. So make sure that you check with your cemetery if they allow plastic flowers and what time of year they allow them, because many of them will not allow plastic flowers during the mowing season. So just take that into consideration. Almost no cemetery allows glass on their cemetery, so glass vases or figurines, porcelain figurines, that kind of thing, will be removed, and that's a safety feature. If it gets hit by a mower blade and glass goes everywhere, and then people are walking around and little kids are crawling around, big safety problem. So we remove anything that's breakable if we see it, even if it's brand new. We'll replace it with a plastic vase if it looks pretty fresh, but we'll remove anything else. We'll take it to the office, and if it's clear whose marker it was on, we'll call that family and let them know, like if they left a figurine or something like that, we'll let them know, like, hey, sometimes it's just like somewhere on the cemetery, just like in the middle of the field somewhere, so we're not able to tell anybody. We'll keep it in the office for a little while and see if anybody claims it, but then we just get rid of it because there's just too much accumulation to just hang on to all those things. You're not allowed to just bury your cremains. If you have family members that are cremated, you can't just go bury them on your family plot, even though it is your plot. The cemetery is legally required to report any person that has been buried on their grounds, so they could be in a lot of legal trouble, and so can you if you just bury somebody. We have to prove who they are. Like, we need the tag from the crematorium to say, this is actually the person, they actually died, and this is who this belongs to. And that just keeps us and you out of legal trouble. Like, you know, if you're the mafia and you're just burying people or something like that, we have to, like, be legally responsible for those types of things. So know that, even though it is your land and it is your lot, the cemetery has the right to know who's being buried there. Yeah, I think that's it for this video. I'm going to talk about human composting in the next segment of this series, and I'm really excited to talk to you about that. I think that it is the new wave of how people are going to be buried or not buried in the future. And I think that it's important for cemeteries to take human composting into consideration, and different ways that I think that we can incorporate human composting. So I'm excited to have that conversation with you. And if you have any thoughts about human composting, please make sure you comment below this video so that we can address them in the next video next week. Also, you can follow me on Instagram. Over the next week, I'm going to be talking a lot about human composting and asking some questions and getting some general community feedback. And I'd love to have your feedback as well. If you know anything about human composting, if you've experienced human composting, or what your ideas are about that, I will be talking about exactly what it is. So if you don't know what it is, you don't have to ask me, well, what is human composting? Because we're going to cover that in the next video for sure. But I would love to hear, if you do know about human composting, what your ideas are about that. And if you have any questions about lots and lot sales in cemeteries, let me know in the comments below. I was talking about cemetery plots, but I do want to make a note that many states still allow you to be buried on your own property and on your own land. So check with your local county office and see if that's an opportunity for you. Many families have stopped doing that because people move away, right? Almost nobody stays in their family property for more than 1 or 2 generations anymore. But that is still a completely valid option. So make sure that you check that out if that's something that you want. You want to be buried on your property. There is a very good chance that you're allowed to do that still, and many people just don't know that that is still allowed. It does have to be disclosed in the property sales. Like, you have to tell people, like, hey, Uncle Joe's in the backyard, because, you know, we want to make sure that he was legally buried there. You do have to file with the county that you're burying someone in your backyard or front yard or the field or wherever you bury them. But yeah, that's completely an option for you. In most cases. There are obviously counties that don't allow you to do that, so double triple check for sure. And they still, I think you still have to follow protocol. It still has to be 4 to 6 feet under, so that's a big hole to dig, or you're gonna have to rent some equipment or something like that. So things to consider. Anyway, that is gonna be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.